why you wouldn't last a day as a soldier in World War II. I remember the mornings more than the nights. Perhaps because mornings came with the illusion of a beginning, even though in war beginnings were only continuations of what never really ended. The air would be cold enough to sting, and the damp soil beneath our boots gave off a smell of rot and iron. You might imagine the day would start with something like order. Maybe a horn or a bell, but the truth is, most of us were already awake long before any call, half dreaming in our trenches, half listening for sounds that told us whether we had survived another hour. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and easily broken by the crack of a rifle in the distance or the shuffle of a rat searching for crumbs near our packs. You think you could sleep through that, but I doubt you would. Even if your eyes closed, your mind would still tremble at every shadow that moved across the dirt wall beside you. The first thing you would notice if you were suddenly dropped into that morning is the hunger, not just the kind you feel when you miss breakfast, but the kind that gnaws at you from the inside, stretching through your ribs as if it were trying to hollow you out. Our rations were small, sometimes nothing more than a stale piece of bread or a tin of meat that smelled older than the earth it came from. Imagine chewing on something dry, trying to swallow it without enough spit because water was too scarce to waste on softening food. Would you last past that first bite? Or would your body revolt at the idea that this was the meal meant to carry you through a day filled with mud, marching, and death at every turn? Then there was the cold. People think of fire when they think of war, of explosions and burning fields, but the cold was the truest enemy. It crept into your bones slowly, made your fingers stiff, made every joint ache. I used to tuck my hands under my arms at night, trying to trap whatever warmth my body still produced. In the morning, pulling on wet socks, sliding into boots that never dried, you felt like you were punishing yourself. Every step squelched, every movement a reminder that warmth was something from another life. Do you think you could walk into that willingly, knowing the chill would never really leave you? When the sun rose, it did not brighten anything. It only revealed how gray everything really was. Faces of the man beside me looked older than they had the night before, as if the hours of darkness had carved deeper lines across their cheeks. You might think camaraderie made it easier, but most mornings we had nothing left to give each other. Words were heavy, and silence was safer. The times we exchanged a nod, sometimes nothing at all. What would you do in that silence? Or would you try to talk to lighten the mood, only to realize your voice felt wrong, too loud for a place that demanded quiet? The weight of the rifle was the next thing you would feel. It was always there, pressing into your shoulder, a constant reminder that you were never free, never unarmed, never more than one moment away from needing it. Have you ever carried something, not for minutes, but for weeks, never setting it down fully, always aware of its presence like an extra limb? It changed the way you moved, the way you breathed. At first, your back protested, then your muscles simply surrendered, accepting the ache as permanent. Could you accept that burden? Not for a day or two, but as the new definition of your body. By midday, the mud would cling to you as if it were alive, caked on your uniform, smeared across your face, creeping under your fingernails. It smelled of dampness and waste, a smell that no amount of washing could ever truly erase. I remember scratching at my skin just to feel clean, though there was never enough water to justify wasting it on such luxuries. You might imagine you would endure it with patience, but the truth is, filth has a way of eating at your dignity until you begin to forget you were once human. Would you last when every part of you begged to be clean, to be new again, and there was no hope of it? Then came the waiting. That was the heart of the day. More than marching or fighting, the endless waiting. Hours stretched in ways you cannot understand until you have lived them. Waiting for orders, waiting for movement, waiting for the sound of artillery that might mean the end. A clock could not measure that kind of time. It was elastic, stretching, until you felt your mind might snap. Men went mad in the stillness, imagining voices in the wind, shapes in the smoke. You might think action would be worse, but no. The waiting was the killer, because it left too much space for your thoughts. Could you sit there in damp silence, not knowing whether the next minute would bring nothing or everything? When the gunfire did come, it shattered the quiet like glass under a hammer. Sudden, deafening, impossible to predict. The ground shook as if the earth itself wanted to reject us. Splinters of wood, shards of stone, dirt flying into the air so thick you could taste it. The sound entered your body, rattling your chest, making your heart stutter. Have you ever been so close to noise that it changed the rhythm of your blood? That was how it felt, and no amount of courage could steady it. Would you still believe you could last, standing in the open with that roar all around you? I remember clutching the dirt, pressing my face into the mud. Not because I thought it would save me, but because there was nowhere else to go. The smell of the earth mixed with the metallic temps of blood and the acrid bite of smoke. Sometimes the man beside you stopped moving, and you had no time to grieve, no space to process it. He was alive a breath ago, and now he was part of the ground you pressed your body against. How would you endure that moment when the line between life and death blurred so casually? And still, when the attack ended, when the silence fell heavy, again you had to rise, brush off the dirt, and continue. No pause, no retreat into comfort. The world expected you to keep moving, to act as if nothing had broken inside you. That was the cruelest part. Not the death, not the hunger, not even the cold, but the demand that you pretend to be whole after everything had been stripped away. Could you stand, shoulders squared, and walk forward as if the pieces of yourself still fit together? Evenings came with exhaustion so deep it was hard to recognize yourself. You thought you knew tired before, but war tired was different. It was not just in the muscles or in the eyes, but in the spirit, a heaviness that dragged every thought into the mud with your body. Sitting down felt like sinking, and sometimes we wished not to rise again. You might think rest would cure it, but rest was only another form of waiting, and waiting was never kind. Do you think you could close your eyes knowing you would only wake to the same, or worse, tomorrow? Letters from home were rare, treasures more precious than food. I remember the way men's hands shook when they unfolded paper, how their lips mouthed the words silently before daring to speak them. Sometimes those letters broke us more than the war itself, reminding us of warmth, of laughter, of children we would not see grow. Could you hold that paper, smelling faint traces of a world that no longer existed for you without breaking apart? At night, when darkness returned, we tried to pretend it was safer. We whispered to ourselves that the enemy would rest too, though we never truly believed it. Every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind through the wire kept us half awake. Sleep was not a refuge, but another kind of gamble, one you might not wake from. I used to stare at the stars when the clouds allowed it, tiny points of light reminding me of how far away peace was. Would you close your eyes beneath that sky, trusting the night not to swallow you whole? That was a single day, just one. The worst, not the bloodiest, not the kind sung about in ballads or etched into history books. Just a day like any other, filled with hunger, cold, fear, waiting, noise, and silence, so heavy it felt eternal. If you think you could last, I wonder if you have truly pictured it, not the glory, not the medals, but the endless erosion of your body and mind until survival itself felt like betrayal. I do not say this to belittle you, but to remind you that war is not made for endurance. It is made for breaking, and only those who are broken in just the right ways ever manage to remain. And so I ask again, quietly, as I lay my head against the rough edge of memory, could you really last even one day as a soldier in that war? Or with the first breath of cold, the first taste of hunger, the first echo of gunfire already send you searching for a way back home? Morning again, though to call it morning feels dishonest. For the light that crept across the horizon was not the kind that promised a new day, but only a dim reminder. That time had not stopped in the night. You would expect a sunrise to be something gentle, maybe even beautiful, but in those days it was merely the unveiling of another round of hardship. The damp trench walls shivered under thin rays of pale gold, and men stirred slowly, each movement stiff, as though their bones no longer believed in the usefulness of rising. I remember looking at their faces and thinking they all looked like statues, carved from the same clay and left unfinished. That is what war did. It carved and carved until you wondered if there would be anything left. Could you look in the mirror after such mornings and still recognize yourself? Its breakfast, if you could call it that, was the same as always, hard. Biscuits, bits of canned meat, sometimes only a spoonful of something gray we told ourselves was soup. You would not last long on such meals. Your body, used to fullness, to the richness of butter and bread, would complain loudly, but there was no one to listen. Hunger became another companion, one that whispered constantly in the stomach, in the throat, even in the brain. Men dreamt not of peace, not of women, not even of safety, but of food, warm loaves, steaming bowls, plates piled high with memory. Could you last through those dreams, waking only to find your lips chewing on nothing but air, stretched into drills, into orders barked from lips as cracked as our own? March here, march there, carry this, dig that. Our commanders wanted us moving, even when there was nowhere to go, as if movement itself could ward off despair. I remember the blisters on my feet bursting, the skin peeling away until every step felt like pressing glass into my flesh. But still, we marched, for to stumble was to shame yourself before the others, and shame was as heavy a burden as fear. Would you lift that rifle again after the 100th step, the 1000th? While your skin screamed and your body begged for relief, some men tried to distract themselves with conversation, but words had lost much of their power by then. Do you talk about when every subject leads back to death, or to home, which was just another kind of death we were missing? So we kept silent, our breath visible in the cold air, our footsteps the only music. Have you ever walked so long in silence that you forgot the sound of your own voice? That was what war did. It stole even the simple rhythm of speech. Could you bear that silence, day after day, until your own tongue felt foreign in your mouth? Then came the digging. Trenches never finished themselves, and mud walls collapsed as easily as a weary man. We dug with shovels, with hands, with anything that might move the earth an inch. The soil was heavy, soaked with rain, clinging to the metal like it wanted to remain where it was. Our backs bent like bows, our shoulders cracked, but we kept digging, because if we did not, we would have no shelter when the shells returned. Imagine carving your own grave day after day, and you would come close to knowing what it felt like. Could you raise that shovel again after hours of labor, knowing tomorrow the same wall would cave in and mock your efforts? At noon, if noon even mattered, we paused to chew what little we had saved from the morning. Sometimes I kept half a biscuit in my pocket, only to find it soggy and spoiled when I reached for it later. Rats had more luck than we did. They grew, fat on crumbs we lost, darting between boots as though the war was theirs to enjoy. I used to envy them, their boldness, their simple survival. Men cursed them, but secretly, I think some admired their freedom. Would you, in your hunger, chase one down, skin it, and eat it without hesitation? Because some of us did, and none of us ever spoke of it afterward. The afternoons brought the sound of artillery practice in the distance, or sometimes not practice at all. The sky would tremble with each boom, clouds scattering like frightened birds. The earth shook, dust rising, our teeth rattling in our skulls. After a while, the sound lived inside you, echoing even when the world was quiet. I remembered dreaming of silence, only to wake and realize the silence had become the loudest sound of all. Could you endure that echo, that phantom ringing, until even your own heartbeat felt like a drum? We trained when there was time. Though training was less about learning and more about reminding our bodies they belonged to the army now. Crawling through mud, bayonets fixed, pretending the sacks of straw were enemies. Cute, but nothing could prepare you for the real thing. The first time your bayonet met flesh, it was not like the training. Flesh resisted, then gave way in a way that straw never could. The memory of it clung to your hands, no matter how many times you washed them. Could you close your eyes at night with that sensation still burning in your palms? Some afternoons ended in letters being read aloud, men huddling together to listen to words from home. I remember one soldier reading a line about an orchard in bloom, its branches heavy with fruit, and we all sat in silence, tasting the sweetness that did not exist where we were. A letter could save a man or destroy him. Sometimes, after reading, a soldier would walk away quietly, sit alone, and never come back the same. Would you open that envelope, not knowing if it held comfort or the final shattering of hope? The evenings were colder, the light slipping away long before we wanted it. 2. Shadows stretched across the trenches, and we lit what little lamps we had, shielding them with our hands as though the enemy might see our tiny flames. Darkness was not peace. It was only another form of fear. Patrols went out, boots soft in the mud, rifles heavy in the dark. Every rustle of grass, every creak of wood made our fingers tighten on triggers. Have you ever listened so hard that your ears ached, straining to hear what might kill you before you could even see it? That was night in the war. Could you bear that tension until your nerves frayed into nothing? And when the night fighting did come, it was chaos. Flashes of light that blinded more than they revealed, shouting voices that belonged to friend and foe alike, the clash of metal, the scream of wounded men echoing across the void. You might imagine you would fight bravely, but bravery was rare in the dark. Most of us fought because our bodies moved before our minds could stop them. And when it ended, when silence returned, we stared at each other in disbelief, not knowing how we had survived. Could you raise your head in that silence, counting the ones who were gone, pretending you were grateful simply because you were not among them? Sleep was no reward. It came late, broken, fragile. Dreams replayed the day in fragments, sometimes worse than the reality itself. I woke often with my hands clenched, nails cutting into my palms, as though my body still believed it was fighting. Around me, other men twitched, groaned, whispered names of loved ones into the night. The air was thick with unspoken grief, and yet morning always returned, dragging us back into the same cycle. Could you close your eyes, knowing that sleep might bring more terror than waking? That was another day, not extraordinary, not different from the one before or the one after. Hunger, cold, mud, waiting, drilling, fighting, silence, and dreams that felt like wounds. You might think you could handle one or two of these burdens, but together they wove a net you could not escape. That was war, not a single blow that broke you, but the slow, steady pressure of 1,000 small ones. And so I ask you again, gently, as I lay these memories at your feet, if you stepped into that trench with me, would you last even until the night fell again? There are days when I can no longer separate memory from imagination, when the line between what happened and what I feared might happen has blurred into the same heavy shadow. Perhaps that is what war does, after all. It fuses the real with the unreal until both weigh the same inside your chest. I want you to picture it clearly, because if you truly believe you could last a single day in that life, then you must first understand the way each morning was born, not out of rest, but out of exhaustion. We did not wake refreshed. We woke emptied, scraped clean by fear and hunger, and forced to rise again on what little spirit remained. Have you ever started a day already finished, already beaten before the sun had fully climbed? That was how it felt, and I wonder if you could last even that first step into the cold. The routine was supposed to give us structure, to keep our minds from unraveling. Orders at dawn, rations at mid-morning, drills in the afternoon, patrols at dusk. A rhythm of survival, they told us. But the truth is, routine was another chain. There was no freedom even in the simple question of when to eat or where to walk. Every hour belonged to the war, and through us, the war moved like a puppeteer. I think of people back home who spoke of freedom as though it were an idea, when to us, freedom was something as simple as being able to choose which direction to face. When you stood, would you endure that loss? The complete surrender of choice, day after day, until your very body forgot what independence meant. The trench was our home, if such a word can even be used. It smelled of wet earth, of sweat, of urine, where men relieved themselves, too tired to move farther. The walls were always damp, and the floor seemed never to dry. Mud oozed up between the boards we laid down, swallowing them like a slow, hungry animal. Rats scurried in plain sight, bold, as if they knew we would not waste the energy to chase them. At night, they ran across our legs, tugged at bits of fabric, sometimes nipped at skin. One soldier woke with a bite that festered until his whole leg swelled. There was nothing we could do but watch him fever and fade. Would you sleep through that, knowing the dark carried not only the threat of the enemy, but of creatures gnawing at your flesh? And then there was the smell of death, the one no amount of denial could banish. The battlefield did not permit burials. At every turn, sometimes bodies lay where they fell, and the earth refused to hide them quickly enough. The air thickened with it, a mixture of rot and iron and something sweet that sickened the stomach. We stuffed cloth under our noses, smoked cigarettes to drown it out, but nothing worked. The smell clung to us, to our uniforms, to our skin. Even when we were far from it, even years later, I could still catch its trace on the wind. Could you? Inhaled day after day, breathing death until it became the very air you lived on. What I remember most vividly were the small sounds, not the booming artillery or the sharp crack of rifles, but the subtle ones, the drip of water through the trench walls, the scratch of a shovel against stone, the whisper of a comrade's prayer in the dark. Each of these sounds carried more weight than the roar of battle, because they reminded us that time was moving even when we felt trapped. A single drip could measure the endless minutes of waiting. A single prayer could echo louder than explosions. Have you ever lived so long in stillness that every drop of water felt like a bell tolling for your own patience? Would you last through that silence without going mad? When the orders came to move forward, the fear was almost a relief. To stand still had become unbearable, so even danger felt like escape. We clambered out of trenches, boots sliding in mud, rifles clutched like lifelines. The fields ahead stretched flat and open, offering no mercy. Bullets cut the air with a whine that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Men fell, not always with a cry, but sometimes silently, as if they had only tripped on their own weariness. The first time I saw a man I knew crumble beside me without sound, I realized death was not dramatic. It was casual, sudden, indifferent. Would you keep moving, stepping over the fallen, when your own body screamed to lie down beside them? We learned to run bent low, to throw ourselves flat, at the crack of fire, to rise again before hesitation could root us in place. Training told us what to do, but instinct told us when to do it, and instinct came only with terror. The earth erupted around us, shards of stone and soil sprang like knives. My ears rang until I could no longer hear my own breath. Yet through it all, we pressed forward because stopping was worse. Could you command your legs to keep running, knowing each step might be your last? I recall one afternoon when we reached the ruins of a farmhouse. Its roof had collapsed, its windows shattered, but the stone walls still stood. We pressed against them, catching our breath, waiting for the next order. Inside, we found scraps of life, a child's toy half buried, an ash, a broken teacup, a blanket stiff with soot. Someone had lived there once, had sat at that table, had known laughter in that room. The war had erased them, and we stepped into their absence like intruders. Could you stand in that silence, surrounded by ghosts of a family you would never know, feeling both the guilt of your survival and the weight of their absence? We took shelter there for the night, though shelter was too generous a word. The walls did little to keep out the cold, and the smell of burnt wood clung to everything. I lay on the ground, staring at the jagged edges of the roof against the stars, and wondered if those same stars had watched the family who once lived there. Did they look up on clear nights, too, dreaming of peace, never knowing their home would become a ruin filled with frightened soldiers? Would you find comfort in those stars, or would they feel like indifferent eyes watching your suffering? By morning, orders came again, and we moved on. That was how it always went. Never time to linger, never space to process. Grief was a luxury we could not afford, so we packed it inside, layer upon layer, until our hearts became heavy as stone. Perhaps that is why so many men grew silent, their eyes fixed far away. Words would have broken them open, and so they spoke none. Have you ever carried so much unspoken sorrow that you forgot the sound of your own grief? Could you bear that weight without collapsing beneath it? Even when no fighting came, the war found ways to grind us down. Endless drills, endless digging, endless waiting for something to change that never did. The monotony was its own kind of torture, because it reminded us that we were not moving toward victory, but circling endlessly in survival. A man can endure pain if he believes it has meaning, but when pain stretches without purpose, it corrodes him. Could you endure suffering stripped of reason, living only because there was no choice but to continue? Sometimes, in rare moments of stillness, we tried to remember home. We told each other stories, half-truths, half-memories, about mothers who cooked feasts, about wives who smiled at doorways, about fields where the grass bent gently in summer winds. But even those stories hurt, because they reminded us of what we had lost. I once described my childhood's bedroom to a comrade, the small window, the creak of the floorboards, and he wept silently beside me, not for my story, but for his own, which he realized he could no longer recall clearly. Would you dare to remember home, knowing memory itself could become a weapon against you? And then, always, came night again. The dark pressed close, filled with rustles and whispers. Patrols went out, shadows among shadows. We waited, rifles across our knees, every nerve taut as wire. Sleep was not sleep, but collapse, and dreams were not dreams, but reruns of fear. I would wake with my body clenched, lungs gasping, ears ringing from phantom blasts. Morning would come again, gray and unmerciful, asking us to rise. Could you endure that cycle, knowing each day was only a mirror of the last, and each night a rehearsal for your death? That was another day, not remarkable, not remembered in history books, not marked by victory or defeat, just a soldier's day, ordinary in its misery, extraordinary only in the way it demanded endurance beyond what men were meant to give. If you believe you could last even one such day, I invite you to hold these words in your chest tonight and feel their weight. Because the truth is, war does not measure men by their courage, but by their ability to endure the unendurable. And I ask you again, gently, as the stars once asked me, could you last? Dawn again, though it feels strange to call it that, because dawn in war was not the gentle unfolding of light you may imagine, but a kind of unveiling of dread. The sky was always pale, washed of color, as if even the sun hesitated to rise above the battlefield. I would open my eyes with the ache of a body that had not truly rested, with a mind already tired before the day had begun. You may think fatigue is something, long work days, sleepless nights, busy weeks, but this was not that kind of tired. This was a weariness stitched into the bones, a fatigue that could not be shaken off by coffee or by a day of rest, because it lived deeper than muscle. Could you open your eyes to such a morning, knowing the day would only add weight to the burden already pressing against your chest? Breakfast was a ritual of disappointment. Gathered what little remained of rations, passing tins with dented sides, opening them with knives dull from use, a smear of greasy meat, a dry biscuit that broke rather than bent, sometimes a spoonful of something too thin to call stew. Hunger made it taste like life itself, but the body knew it was not enough. Stomachs groaned, not in complaint, but in resignation, because there was nothing else to be done. Imagine beginning your day with a meal that reminded you of how little your body mattered, how little it would be given. Would you take that bite and chew it slowly, convincing yourself it was strength, even as your ribs grew sharper against your skin? Orders followed, always delivered in tones stripped of kindness. March here, carry this, dig deeper, watch the perimeter. Even the voices of commanders were wary, but authority did not bend under exhaustion. We obeyed, not because we believed, but because disobedience was another kind of death. For men muttered under their breath. Some clenched their jaws, but in the end, we all moved as one body pulled by invisible strings. That is how war works. It erases the illusion of individuality. Until you exist only as a fragment of a larger machine, would you accept that erasure? Would you surrender even the smallest choices of movement and thought, simply because survival demanded it? We dug again, because the trenches never stayed the same. Rain softened walls, boots broke edges, shells collapsed corners. The earth seemed alive, unwilling to hold shape, and so we forced it back into lines and walls. Shovels clanged against rock, mud slid into boots, hands blistered and bled. Some men cursed the dirt as though it were an enemy, as though by naming it, they could make it less inevitable. I remember one man screaming at the soil, striking it with his shovel until the handle split. His rage was not at the ground, of course, but at the futility of all our work. Would you bend your back to such endless labor, knowing each scoop of dirt was a postponement, not a salvation? The cold pressed on us even when the sun climbed higher. It lived in our boots, in our gloves, in the breath that hung in the air like smoke. Fingers stiffened until rifles felt heavy and dangerous in our hands. Some men tied rags around their feet, but the rags only grew wet, and wet cloth only deepened the chill. We stomped our boots, not for warmth, but to remind ourselves that our feet were still there, still ours. Do you think you could endure such constant cold, not sharp and biting, but endless and dull, the kind that wore down willpower more than flesh? By midday, if the guns were quiet, we might rest in the trenches, leaning against walls slick with dampness, staring at nothing. Rest, though, was not rest. Minds wandered, and wandering minds are dangerous in war. Thoughts slipped back to home, to warmth, to food, to laughter, and each memory became a cut against the reality before us. Some men smiled as they remembered. Some wept silently, some turned hard and silent so they would not feel anything at all. I used to let my mind drift to the sound of my mother's voice, but often it hurt too much and I forced myself to stop. Would you allow those memories in, risking the pain they carried, or would you bury them so deep that even your own name might fade? The afternoons often brought movement, patrols across scarred fields, watches at half-collapsed walls, marches that led nowhere but back again. Boots sank into mud, rifles knocked against helmets, breaths misted in the air. The fields stretched endlessly, flat and gray, interrupted only by ruins of homes and barns that once stood proud. Sometimes I thought the land itself mourned, its silence heavier than any human voice. Could you walk across such ground? Every step a reminder that life had once bloomed there and would likely never bloom again. When we did encounter the enemy, it was rarely in clear battles. More often, it was sudden, sharp bursts of fire from hidden places, echoes of movement that vanished as quickly as they came. Bullets snapped past like invisible insects, too fast to see, too close to ignore. We threw ourselves down, hugging the earth, faces pressed to mud that smelled of rot. The body's instinct to survive overtook thought, and in those moments, we were no longer men but animals, clawing for another breath. Could you surrender to that instinct? Could you accept the humiliation of survival when dignity had no place? In the mud. I remember one man who froze when the bullets came, standing upright as if disbelieving it could happen to him. He stood long enough for a round to find him, and he fell with a sound that was not a cry, but a sigh. We pulled him into the trench later, his body heavy, his face oddly peaceful. Death did not look like the films or the paintings. It looked like sleep that would not end. Would you keep moving after seeing that, stepping around a man who had shared your bread only the night before? Evening shadows lengthened across the land, and with them came a deeper quiet. The world seemed to hold its breath at dusk, as though preparing for either attack or fragile peace. We lit small lamps, shielding them with our hands, whispering to each other in voices barely above the rustle of grass. Darkness did not comfort us. It only changed the shape of fear. Every whisper of wind through broken wood, every shifting shadow felt like the edge of danger. Could you rest in such darkness, knowing the night might bring sudden fire? When patrols went out, I sometimes volunteered, though fear clenched my stomach each time. Walking in darkness, boots careful against uneven ground, ears straining for the smallest sound, I felt both exposed and invisible. The stars above seemed cruel, offering light but no safety. Every rustle of a leaf, every distant crack tightened the grip on my rifle. More than once, we returned without incident, but the fear lived on, waiting for the night when silence would break. Would you walk through that blackness, knowing each step could carry you into unseen death? And when the night ended, when exhaustion pressed heavier than fear, we lay down in trenches, heads resting on arms or packs. Sleep was shallow, broken by dreams that replayed the day in distorted echoes. I woke often with the taste of dirt in my mouth, with hands clenched around the rifle I refused to set aside. Round me, men muttered in their dreams, some calling names of those they loved, some whispering prayers half finished. Sleep was not escape, but another battlefield. What? You close your eyes into such unrest, knowing you might wake to another day indistinguishable from the last. That was another day, one of many, neither the worst nor the best. It blurred into the others until time itself lost meaning. The war did not measure us in days or months, but in how much of ourselves we could still carry, if you think you could. Last, picture this: waking into exhaustion, eating, hunger, working futility, marching nowhere, fearing silence, embracing mud, and sleeping into unrest. That was a day. Could you last? There is a heaviness that comes not from any one moment of war, but from the accumulation of them all. A weight that settles into your body so deeply that you no longer notice when it grows heavier. That was how another day began for us, not with a single event, but with the dragging of all the previous days behind us, a burden we carried without pause. When I opened my eyes in the half-light of dawn, I already felt older, as though the night had carved years into my bones. It is a strange thing to feel aged each morning, to rise, not refreshed, but eroded. You ever felt yourself wither, not over decades, but over hours? That was what war did, and I wonder how you would bear it. If you would bear it at all. The ground was wet again, because it always seemed wet, as if the earth itself wept constantly. I pushed myself up from the damp boards, brushing mud from my sleeves that would only return in minutes. Round me, men stirred with the same slowness, their faces slack with sleep that was not sleep, their eyes dull with expectation rather than surprise. No one asked what the day would bring. The answer was always the same: hunger, cold, waiting, and perhaps death if fate chose it. Could you rise into a morning already knowing its script, already feeling the futility of resistance? Rations were passed out, thin and meager, the same familiar disappointment. A tin passed from hand to hand, a crust of bread broken into uneven pieces. I chewed slowly, not for flavor, but for the simple act of making the moment last longer, stretching the illusion of nourishment. Hunger was no longer a sharp pain, but a constant background hum, like the drone of insects in summer fields back home. We carried it, not as suffering, but as part of ourselves. Would you learn to carry hunger so patiently, to let it become as ordinary as breath? Orders came, as they always did, and we obeyed without question. Some mornings we marched, some mornings we dug, some mornings we simply waited for news. Today, it was marching, boots sinking into mud that seemed determined to pull us down. Each step was an argument between will and weight, between forward and collapse. The horizon stretched endlessly, gray upon gray, and the air stung with the promise of rain. We did not talk much. Words required energy, and energy was too precious to spend. Our silence was not emptiness, but endurance. Could you walk miles in such silence, surrounded by men, yet utterly alone in your own thoughts? We passed fields, once tilled by farmers, now shattered and barren. Fences broken, barns collapsed, orchards stripped of fruit. Imagined the lives that had once thrived there, the laughter of children running between trees, the sound of tools striking soil, the smell of bread baked in ovens, now cold. The war had erased it all, leaving only echoes for us to stumble through. Sometimes I wondered if we were the intruders, trespassing on the graves of ordinary days. Would you walk through such ruins without feeling the guilt of survival pressing into your steps? By midday, the sky opened and rain fell, cold and relentless. Our coats soaked quickly, the weight dragging at our shoulders. Water filled the trenches we passed, pooled in every hollow, turned the ground into a swamp that clung to boots until each step was a battle. We pulled scarves tighter around our necks, but the water seeped in anyway, tracing icy paths down our skin. Men coughed, teeth chattering, voices breaking into shivers. I remember looking at my hands, swollen and pale, and wondering how long they could still hold a rifle. Cat, you stand in that rain hour after hour, feeling it seep not just into your clothes but into your spirit, until even your heart felt damp and heavy. The march ended in another trench, deeper than the last, but no drier. We collapsed against its walls, water dripping from helmets, mud clinging in thick layers. The order was to hold position, to wait for further instructions. Waiting, always waiting. Time in war was not measured by clocks, but by the shifting of weight from one aching limb to another. by the number of times you blinked against the drizzle, by the hollow rumble of your stomach. Okay, could you endure such waiting, knowing each second was a rehearsal for an unknown catastrophe? As we waited, I watched the men around me. Some stared at nothing, their eyes glazed. Some cleaned rifles already clean, a nervous ritual to keep hands busy. One man drew lines in the mud with a stick, little shapes that disappeared as quickly as he made them. I wondered what comfort he found in that act, what memory it tied him to. We all had such rituals, tiny rebellions against the monotony, fragile anchors to humanity. Would you find such a ritual for yourself, or would the weight of meaninglessness drown you before you could? The enemy did not announce themselves when they came. A sudden crack split the air, a bullet whined past, and chaos erupted. We pressed into the mud, rifles raised, ears ringing as shots echoed in the rain. Smoke and water mixed into a choking fog, obscuring everything beyond arm's reach. Orders were shouted, but lost in the thunder of guns. I fired blindly, not knowing if the figure in my sights was friend or foe, only knowing that hesitation could mean death. Could you squeeze the trigger in such confusion, living with the knowledge that you may have ended a life without certainty? The firefight was brief, as most were, a flurry of noise, then silence thicker than before. We counted the missing, dragged the wounded closer, pressed cloth, 2 bleeding wounds already too wide to close. One man groaned softly, eyes fixed on the rain above him, lips moving in a prayer I could not hear. His hand clutched mine with surprising strength until it loosened suddenly, leaving me holding nothing but a memory. Could you look into the face of a man as life slipped from him, knowing you were helpless to keep it tethered? Afterward, the trench was quieter, the air heavier. We sat in mud, darkened by more than water, each of us wrapped in our own silence. No words could balance the weight of what had been lost, so we let the silence carry it for us. I leaned against the wall, staring at the rain dripping from the edge above, counting drops as though numbers could hold back grief. Would you sit in that silence without breaking, or would you cry out simply to hear a human sound? Evening fell, though the clouds made it difficult to tell where day ended and night began. We lit no lamps for fear of drawing fire, so darkness claimed us quickly. Shadows, blurred faces, turned men into outlines. The rain slowed but never ceased, a constant whisper against the earth. We sat, huddled in our coats, rifles across our knees, listening to the endless dripping. Every sound outside the trench felt like a threat. The snap of a twig, the roll of distant thunder, the shuffle of unseen steps. Could you sit awake in that darkness, every nerve straining, waiting for danger you could not see? When sleep finally came, it was not sleep, but collapse. I lay curled in damp fabric, cheek pressed to wet wood, dreams tangled with fear. In one dream, I walked through my childhood home, only to find mud seeping across the floorboards, rising until it swallowed everything. I woke with a gasp, heart pounding, hands clenching my rifle as though it could fight off dreams. Round me, others stirred, muttered, shifted in restless slumber. None of us truly slept, not in the way you think of sleep, okay? We simply fell into darkness and hoped to rise again. Okay, could you rest like that, night after night, never truly safe, even in your own mind? That was another day, not marked by triumph or by great loss, not carved into history books, but heavy enough to carve itself into the hearts of those who lived it. Hunger, rain, waiting, fear, silence, collapse. If you still believe you could last a day, then picture yourself here, soaked to the bone, clutching a rifle, waiting for dawn that will only bring the same. Could you last? There is something peculiar about how the body adapts to misery. It does not resist forever. It bends. It shapes itself to the conditions. It accepts the unacceptable as ordinary. That is what struck me most about waking again in the trench on yet another day. not the shock of discomfort, but the strange normalcy of it. The smell of damp earth, the ache in my joints, the taste of stale bread, all of it had become routine, as familiar as childhood rituals once were. It is frightening how quickly a man can learn to live in squalor, how his definition of normal rewrites itself under pressure. Would you accept that rewriting, or would you crumble under the thought that life had shrunk so small? I pulled myself up from the mud, my uniform heavy with water from the night's rain. The boards beneath me creaked, swollen and soft. Rats skittered away at my movement, bold enough to have crept close while I slept. I remember staring at them for a moment, wondering if they pitied us or mocked us. They were survivors, thriving in the filth we detested, eating scraps we would have fought over. Some soldiers said rats were lucky omens, others cursed them as vermin, but to me they were only mirrors, creatures that proved survival was possible, even here. Could you look into those beady eyes without seeing yourself reflected back? Reduced to instincts of hunger and fear. The morning ration came late, a thin smear of grease on bread that tasted more of damp air than of grain. I chewed it slowly, forcing it down with sips of water that smelled faintly of rust. My stomach complained, but I ignored it. Complaints had no place in war. A man could moan all he wanted, but hunger would not ease, cold would not vanish, orders would not soften. Complaints were only reminders of weakness, and weakness was dangerous. Have you ever bitten back a cry of discomfort simply because you knew it would not change the reality before you? That was what every meal taught us. Soon after came the order to move. We rose, groaning as our bodies protested, and slung rifles across our shoulders. The mud pulled at our boots as if begging us to stay, but we marched on, bent against the drizzle that had begun again. The air smelled sharp with smoke from distant fires, and the horizon offered nothing but gray fields littered with stumps of trees. Once they had been forests, places of shade and life. Now they were only jagged reminders of what shells could do. Each broken trunk seemed like a corpse frozen mid-scream. Could you walk through such a landscape without feeling the echo of destruction in your own chest? We marched for hours, though time was difficult to measure. Watches had stopped long ago, their gears clogged with mud and rain. Time was counted in steps, in breaths, in the rhythm of boots striking wet earth. My shoulders ached from the weight of my pack, but I dared not shift it too often. Such small movements could rub skin raw, and wounds festered easily in the filth. I thought often of those who romanticized marching armies, who imagined straight lines and proud faces. The reality was hunched backs, blistered feet, and silence broken only by coughing. Would you keep walking, step after step, when every part of your body screamed for rest? By midday, the order was given to halt and dig in. Another trench, another wound carved into the earth. We dug with shovels that seemed too heavy for our tired arms, throwing clumps of wet soil aside, building walls that might hold long enough to matter. The ground sucked at the blades, resisting each scoop as though it wanted to remain unbroken. Sweat mixed with rain until our faces stung, but still we dug. The trench was life. Without it, we were exposed. The irony never escaped me. We carved our own prisons willingly, because the alternative was death. Would you lower your back to that labor again and again, shaping graves to sleep in? The guns began in the afternoon, distant at first, like thunder rolling across hills, then closer, sharper, until the very air trembled. Shells whistled overhead, crashing into earth with shuddering force. Dirt and rock sprayed into the sky, raining down in heavy clumps. We pressed ourselves against the walls, covering our heads with trembling arms. The sound was indescribable, not just loud, but total, filling every space inside the body until even thought could not escape. My ears rang so violently I thought I had gone deaf, only to realize later that silence itself had become foreign. Could you endure that noise, hour after hour, feeling the earth buck and roar beneath you? One shell landed close, so close the trench wall collapsed inward, bearing a man beside me up to his waist. We clawed at the dirt, dragging him out with bleeding fingers, but by the time we freed him, he no longer breathed. His eyes stared blankly, specks of soil still clinging to his lashes. There was no time for mourning. The guns continued, and we had to keep low. So we left him where he fell, another piece of earth among the rest. Would you continue fighting, sitting inches from a man whose body still radiated warmth, though his life was gone? When at last the barrage ended, silence fell heavy. Ears still rang, lungs still heaved with dust, but the absence of sound was worse than the noise. We looked at each other with wide, hollow eyes, each silently asking the same question: how long until the next round? My hand shook as I tried to steady my rifle. Courage was not what carried us forward, only exhaustion and habit. Could you lift your weapon with trembling hands, convincing yourself you were ready to use it again? As evening approached, the rain finally ceased, leaving the air damp and raw. The trench smelled stronger now, a mixture of sweat, mud, and blood. Some men muttered prayers, others simply stared at the ground. I found myself watching the sky, pale streaks of sunset slipping through heavy clouds. The colors looked strange, almost unreal against the gray of war. For a brief moment, I remembered sunsets at home, when the horizon burned gold and red above fields of grain. The memory hurt, sharp and sudden, but I clung to it anyway. Would you dare to hold such memories, knowing they could break you more than the war itself? Night crept in, slow and relentless. We lit no lamps for fear of drawing fire, so the dark claimed us entirely. Patrols went out again, their footsteps soft, their faces vanishing into black. I remained in the trench, ears straining at every sound. My nerves twitched with each rustle, each drip of water, each sigh of wind. Fear in daylight was sharp and defined. Kara, fear in darkness was endless, shapeless, a tide that pressed from every side. Could you sit in such darkness, waiting for an enemy who might already be among you? Sleep, when it came, was shallow and cruel. I dreamed of walking through my hometown, but the streets were filled with mud and the houses burned silently. I reached for the door of my childhood home, but it crumbled at my touch, leaving only ash. I woke with my heart pounding, my hand clutching my rifle so tight my knuckles ached. Round me, men stirred with their own nightmares, whispering names, groaning softly. We did not speak of them in the morning, okay? We simply carried them like another wound. Could you live with such dreams, knowing they would never let you truly rest? That was another day. Hunger, marching, digging, shell fire, silence, fear, restless dreams. Nothing remarkable, nothing heroic, nothing to be written in the proud pages of history. Yet it was a day heavy enough to break the spirit of any who lived it. If you still believe you could last, imagine yourself there, in the mud, in the smoke, in the silence that followed. Could you endure? Could you last? There are mornings when the trench feels less like a place of shelter and more like a mouth, ready to swallow us whole. I woke into one of those mornings, the damp wood pressing against my cheek, the faint trickle of water dripping somewhere behind my head. The air was so heavy with moisture that it felt like breathing through cloth. I sat up slowly, stretching limbs that protested with sharp aches. And for a moment, I wondered how many mornings had begun exactly like this. They blurred together into one endless repetition, so much so that I sometimes doubted whether days truly passed at all. Perhaps time had ended and we were simply circling the same hours forever. Could you endure the weight of time when it no longer moved forward, but only pressed downward, crushing every moment into sameness? The ration that day was smaller than usual, a thin slice of bread and a few drops of broth that barely warmed the hands holding it. I ate without tasting, chewing because it was habit rather than nourishment. Hunger had become a dull ache that never left, a constant companion whispering in the belly. At times, I wondered if the hunger was better than being full, because at least it reminded me I was still alive, still in need. But the truth is, it drained more than it gave. My hands shook from weakness as much as from fear. Could you carry on with a body that no longer felt like a source of strength, but like a burden you had to drag along with you? Orders came quickly. Patrols to be sent out, trenches to be reinforced, weapons to be cleaned. The monotony of it disguised its cruelty. The tasks were never ending, each one erasing the small hope of rest. We moved automatically, our bodies responding to command more than to will. I cleaned my rifle with trembling fingers, wiping away mud that would only return within hours. The metal was cold, unyielding, smelling faintly of oil. I sometimes thought of it as an extra limb, though not one of my choosing. Imagine holding something day after day until its weight fused into your identity. Could you accept a life where even your shadow seemed to carry a weapon? The patrol left before noon, and I was among those chosen. We climbed from the trench, boots sinking into mud that sucked at each step like a greedy hand. The landscape stretched out flat and broken, pockmarked with craters, scattered with twisted remnants of barbed wire and wood. A mist clung to the ground, curling around our legs, muting the horizon. Each step was cautious, measured, ears straining for sounds beyond a steady thud of boots. My breath echoed loudly in my own head, and I wished it would quiet. Fear in daylight was a different creature, sharper, because the world was visible, and every shadow could hold danger. Would you walk into that open silence, knowing that the next step might be your last one? We found nothing at first, only silence broken by distant echoes of gunfire. The air smelled of smoke and damp earth, the kind of smell that clung to the teeth. Throat birds no longer sang in those fields. Nature itself had abandoned them. We paused at the ruins of a farmhouse, its roof long gone, its walls sagging inward. Inside, the remnants of a table still stood, though blackened and broken. I traced a hand across the surface, imagining the meals once served there, the laughter that once filled that room. It was not just soldiers the war killed, but the very memory of ordinary life. Could you stand in that ruin without feeling like an intruder in someone else's tragedy? We moved on quickly, not daring to linger. The silence felt dangerous, too, deliberate. And then, as if the world had been waiting, shots cracked from the tree line. Bullets tore the air, sharp and sudden, and we dropped into the mud. My heart raced faster than my thoughts. I pressed my face into the soil, the smell of rot and iron filling my nose. The ground shook as more fire erupted, and men shouted words I could not understand. I raised my rifle, fired blindly, the recoil jolting my shoulder. My mind was empty, my body moving because it had to. Could you fire into the unknown, never knowing if your bullet struck enemy or empty air, only trusting instinct to keep you alive? The fight was brief, as they often were. A few minutes of chaos, then silence so thick it felt like suffocation. One of ours did not rise again. I lay twisted in the mud, eyes wide, lips parted. I wanted to close his eyes, but my hands would not move. I stared at him until another soldier pulled me away. Death in war was not rare, not shocking, but each time it left a bruise on the spirit. Would you keep walking past the body of a man who had shared your rations just hours before, carrying on as though the world had not shifted? We returned to the trench in silence, boots heavy, shoulders slumped. The others looked at us with questions in their eyes, but no one spoke. We settled back into routine as though nothing had changed, because, in truth, Nothing had. One man. Gone. The war still grinding forward. I sat against the wall, cleaning my rifle again, though my hands shook more than before. My ears still rang with phantom echoes of gunfire. Could you return to the same rituals, pretending they brought order, when inside you felt only the unraveling? Afternoon dragged, slow and thick. The rain returned, first as drizzle, then as steady sheets that blurred the horizon. Water pooled at the bottom of the trench, soaking socks, chilling legs. Some men tried to bail it out with helmets, but the effort was useless. The earth wanted to drown us, and perhaps it was kinder than bullets. I shifted my feet constantly to keep blood moving, but still the numbness crept in. Cold was a quieter killer, slower, but no less certain. Could you sit for hours with water up to your ankles, knowing the chill was crawling deeper into your bones with each passing moment? Evening came gray and dim. The rain softened, but the air remained heavy, pressing against lungs with a damp weight. We shared what little food remained, another crust of bread, another scrap of meat. The taste was absent, the act mechanical. One man spoke of home, of the orchard his father once tended, of apples sweet and crisp. His voice broke halfway through, and silence followed. No one knew how to comfort him, because we all carried our own orchards inside us, and all of them were gone. Would you listen to such words without breaking? Or would your own memories rise up to strangle you? One shell landed close, so close the trench wall collapsed inward, bearing a man beside me up to his waist. We clawed at the dirt, dragging him out with bleeding fingers, but by the time we freed him, he no longer breathed. His eyes stared blankly, specks of soil still clinging to his lashes. There was no time for mourning. The guns continued, and we had to keep low, so we left him where he fell, another piece of earth among the rest. Would you continue fighting, sitting inches from a man whose body still radiated warmth, though his life was gone? When at last the barrage ended, silence fell heavy. Ears still rang, lungs still heaved with dust, but the absence of sound was worse than the noise. We looked at each other with wide, hollow eyes, each silently asking the same question: how long until the next round? My hand shook as I tried to steady my rifle. Courage was not what carried us forward, only exhaustion and habit. Could you lift your weapon with trembling hands, convincing yourself you were ready to use it again? As evening approached, the rain finally ceased, leaving the air damp and raw. The trench smelled stronger now, a mixture of sweat, mud, and blood. Some men muttered prayers, others simply stared at the ground. I found myself watching the sky, pale streaks of sunset slipping through heavy clouds. The colors looked strange, almost unreal against the gray of war. For a brief moment, I remembered sunsets at home, when the horizon burned gold and red above fields of grain. The memory hurt, sharp and sudden, but I clung to it anyway. Would you dare to hold such memories, knowing they could break you more than the war itself? Night crept in, slow and relentless. We lit no lamps for fear of drawing fire, so the dark claimed us entirely. Patrols went out again, their footsteps soft, their faces vanishing into black. I remained in the trench, ears straining at every sound. My nerves twitched with each rustle, each drip of water, each sigh of wind. Fear in daylight was sharp and defined. Kara, fear in darkness was endless, shapeless, a tide that pressed from every side. Could you sit in such darkness, waiting for an enemy who might already be among you? Sleep, when it came, was shallow and cruel. I dreamed of walking through my hometown, but the streets were filled with mud and the houses burned silently. I reached for the door of my childhood home, but it crumbled at my touch, leaving only ash. I woke with my heart pounding, my hand clutching my rifle so tight my knuckles ached. Round me, men stirred with their own nightmares, whispering names, groaning softly. We did not speak of them in the morning, okay? We simply carried them like another wound. Could you live with such dreams, knowing they would never let you truly rest? That was another day. Hunger, marching, digging, shellfire, silence, fear, restless, dreams. Nothing remarkable, nothing heroic, nothing to be written in the proud pages of history. Yet it was a day heavy enough to break the spirit of any who lived it. If you still believe you could last, imagine yourself there, in the mud, in the smoke, in the silence that followed. Could you endure? Could you last? There are mornings when the trench feels less like a place of shelter and more like a mouth, ready to swallow us whole. I woke into one of those mornings, the damp wood pressing against my cheek, the faint trickle of water dripping somewhere behind my head. The air was so heavy with moisture that it felt like breathing through cloth. I sat up slowly, stretching limbs that protested with sharp aches. And for a moment, I wondered how many mornings had begun exactly like this. They blurred together into one endless repetition, so much so that I sometimes doubted whether days truly passed at all. Perhaps time had ended and we were simply circling the same hours forever. Could you endure the weight of time when it no longer moved forward, but only pressed downward, crushing every moment into sameness? The ration that day was smaller than usual, a thin slice of bread and a few drops of broth that barely warmed the hands holding it. I ate without tasting, chewing because it was habit rather than nourishment. Hunger had become a dull ache that never left, a constant companion whispering in the belly. At times, I wondered if the hunger was better than being full, because at least it reminded me I was still alive, still in need. But the truth is, it drained more than it gave. My hands shook from weakness as much as from fear. Could you carry on with a body that no longer felt like a source of strength, but like a burden you had to drag along with you? Orders came quickly. Patrols to be sent out, trenches to be reinforced, weapons to be cleaned. The monotony of it disguised its cruelty. The tasks were never ending, each one erasing the small hope of rest. We moved automatically, our bodies responding to command more than to will. I cleaned my rifle with trembling fingers, wiping away mud that would only return within hours. The metal was cold, unyielding, smelling faintly of oil. I sometimes thought of it as an extra limb, though not one of my choosing. Imagine holding something day after day until its weight fused into your identity. Could you accept a life where even your shadow seemed to carry a weapon? The patrol left before noon, and I was among those chosen. I climbed from the trench, boots sinking into mud that sucked at each step like a greedy hand. The landscape stretched out flat and broken, pockmarked with craters, scattered with twisted remnants of barbed wire and wood. A mist clung to the ground, curling around our legs, muting the horizon. Each step was cautious, measured, ears straining for sounds beyond a steady thud of boots. My breath echoed loudly in my own head, and I wished it would quiet. Fear in daylight was a different creature, sharper, because the world was visible, and every shadow could hold danger. Would you walk into that open silence, knowing that the next step might be your last one? We found nothing at first, only silence broken by distant echoes of gunfire. The air smelled of smoke and damp earth, the kind of smell that clung to the teeth. Throat birds no longer sang in those fields. Nature itself had abandoned them. We paused at the ruins of a farmhouse, its roof long gone, its walls sagging inward. Inside, the remnants of a table still stood, though blackened and broken. I traced a hand across the surface, imagining the meals once served there, the laughter that once filled that room. It was not just soldiers the war killed, but the very memory of ordinary life. Could you stand in that ruin without feeling like an intruder in someone else's tragedy? We moved on quickly, not daring to linger. The silence felt dangerous, too, deliberate. And then, as if the world had been waiting, shots cracked from the tree line. Bullets tore the air, sharp and sudden, and we dropped into the mud. My heart raced faster than my thoughts. I pressed my face into the soil, the smell of rot and iron filling my nose. The ground shook as more fire erupted, and men shouted words I could not understand. I raised my rifle, fired blindly, the recoil jolting my shoulder. My mind was empty, my body moving because it had to. Could you fire into the unknown, never knowing if your bullet struck enemy or empty air, only trusting instinct to keep you alive? The fight was brief, as they often were. A few minutes of chaos, then silence so thick it felt like suffocation. One of ours did not rise again. I lay twisted in the mud, eyes wide, lips parted. I wanted to close his eyes, but my hands would not move. I stared at him until another soldier pulled me away. Death in war was not rare, not shocking, but each time it left a bruise on the spirit. Would you keep walking past the body of a man who had shared your rations just hours before, carrying on as though the world had not shifted? We returned to the trench in silence, boots heavy, shoulders slumped. The others looked at us with questions in their eyes, but no one spoke. We settled back into routine as though nothing had changed, because, in truth, nothing had. One man, gone, the war still grinding forward. I sat against the wall, cleaning my rifle again, though my hands shook more than before. My ears still rang with phantom echoes of gunfire. Could you return to the same rituals, pretending they brought order, when inside you felt only the unraveling? Afternoon dragged, slow and thick. The rain returned, first as drizzle, then as steady sheets that blurred the horizon. Water pooled at the bottom of the trench, soaking socks, chilling legs. Some men tried to bail it out with helmets, but the effort was useless. The earth wanted to drown us, and perhaps it was kinder than bullets. I shifted my feet constantly to keep blood moving, but still the numbness crept in. Cold was a quieter killer, slower, but no less certain. Could you sit for hours with water up to your ankles, knowing the chill was crawling deeper into your bones with each passing moment? Evening came gray and dim. The rain softened, but the air remained heavy, pressing against lungs with a damp weight. We shared what little food remained, another crust of bread, another scrap of meat. The taste was absent, the act mechanical. One man spoke of home, of the orchard his father once tended, of apples sweet and crisp. His voice broke halfway through, and silence followed. No one knew how to comfort him, because we all carried our own orchards inside us, and all of them were gone. Would you listen to such words without breaking? Or would your own memories rise up to strangle you? Rations were handed out with the same routine indifference. A sliver of bread, a sip of bitter coffee, a scrap of meat, so thin it might have been air. We ate because there was nothing else, not because we believed it would help. The bread was damp, tasting faintly of mold, but I swallowed it anyway. Hunger made even the worst food sacred. My stomach tightened as if mocking the offering, but I ignored it. Complaints were dangerous, not because they angered commanders, but because they reminded others of the weakness they were already trying to forget. Could you chew on rot and call it strength, telling yourself it was enough when you knew it was not? Orders came quickly: march, scout, dig. Always the same words, spoken in the same flat tone. I slung my rifle across my shoulder, the weight familiar, hateful, necessary. We climbed from the trench and set off across the fields, still wet with dew, boots sinking into soft earth. The sky above was low, the color of ash, and the air smelled faintly of smoke from battles we had not fought but could still taste. Each step was heavy, each breath sharp. My legs moved not from will but from habit, as though the body had decided it would continue, even when the mind no longer cared. Would you keep walking, day after day, when your mind begged you to stop, but your body dragged you forward anyway? We came upon a village, or what had once been one. Roofs collapsed, walls shattered, streets littered with debris. The silence there was deeper than the fields, because it was filled with the memory of voices that no longer existed. I stepped over a child's toy, half buried in rubble, and felt my stomach twist. It was not the dead who haunted me most, but the absence of the living, the way a place carried the echo of laughter that would never return. Could you walk through such ruins without feeling the weight of every life stolen from them pressing into your chest? The village offered little shelter, but we paused there anyway, crouching behind what walls remained. Some men searched for scraps, food, cloth, anything useful, but found almost nothing. I sat on a broken step, running my fingers across, stone blackened by fire, and wondered who had once sat there before me. Perhaps a family had shared stories there. Perhaps children had played at its base. Now it was only another perch for a weary soldier. Would you sit in such a place without feeling the guilt of being alive where others had perished? By midday, the mist returned, curling through broken beams and shattered windows. Visibility dropped until the village seemed to dissolve into shadow. We tightened grips on rifles, eyes straining, hearts racing. Every shifting silhouette became a possible threat. The fog was thick enough to feel against the skin, cool and damp, and I wondered if it carried voices we could not hear. Fear in the fog was relentless because it left no boundary between reality and imagination. Could you keep your sanity when you could no longer trust even your own eyes? A shot cracked suddenly, echoing through the haze. We dropped low, pressing against debris, rifles raised. More shots followed, then silence. My breath came sharp, my fingers tight on the trigger, sweat cold on my back, despite the chill. We waited for movement, for sound, for anything to justify the terror tightening our chests. Minutes stretched impossibly long. Finally, another order came, move forward. And so we did, slowly, cautiously, hearts hammering with each step. Would you advance into fog that might hold death a few feet ahead, trusting nothing but chance to spare you? The firefight, when it came, was chaos. Flashes of light in the mist, screams that seemed to come from every direction, the crash of debris as bullets struck. I fired, ducked, crawled, pressed my face into dirt that smelled of ash. Time lost meaning. There was only noise, fear, and movement. When it ended, silence returned so suddenly it felt violent. The fog lifted slightly, revealing two of ours lying still on the ground. Their faces were pale, their eyes fixed. We dragged them back, but no words were spoken. What was there to say? Could you look at them and not wonder when your own body would lie the same way? Marched back to the trench in silence, our boots leaving prints that the rain quickly erased. Back in the narrow safety of earth walls, we slumped against mud, exhaustion heavy as lead. Some men closed their eyes, though sleep would not come. Others cleaned rifles that did not need cleaning. One stared at his hands as though they no longer belonged to him. I simply sat, head bowed, listening to the faint ringing in my ears that refused to leave. Kay, would you sit there, surrounded by ghosts, and still rise again when the next order came? Evening settled in, gray, folding into black. The trench filled with shadows, faces fading into outlines. We shared the last of the day's rations, barely a mouthful each, chewing slowly to stretch the moment. Conversation was sparse. One man hummed a tune, faint and cracked, before falling silent when his voice broke. The rest of us stared at the ground, too weary for comfort. Could you endure meals that brought no strength? conversations that brought no relief, nights that brought no rest. Patrols left again after dark, figures vanishing into night. I stayed behind, listening for their return. The silence stretched, broken only by the occasional distant boom of artillery. My chest tightened with each passing minute. At last they returned, but one was missing. No explanation was given, no question asked. We simply adjusted our count as though subtraction had become part of the routine. Could you live in a world where absence itself was ordinary? Sleep came fitfully. I dreamed of home again, but in the dream my house was filled with fog, rooms endless, doors locked. I wandered through it, calling names I could not remember, until the walls collapsed inward. I woke gasping, my rifle still clutched to my chest, sweat cold across my skin. Around me, others stirred in the same broken rhythm, haunted by dreams that did not end when their eyes opened. Could you survive a world where even sleep betrayed you? And that was another day. Ruin, fog, firefight, absence, silence, restless dreams. Nothing recorded in history, nothing sung in songs, yet heavy enough to crush those who lived it. If you still think you could last, picture yourself here, in the silence, in the hunger, in the endless gray. Could you last? The days had begun to fold into one another so completely that I could no longer separate one from the next. Each morning felt like the continuation of a single, endless night, each evening like a pause rather than a conclusion. That was the cruelest part of war, not the violence, not even the hunger, but the way it erased the sense of time, of progress, of movement forward. We were suspended in an eternal present, heavy with mud, smoke, and fear. Awoke into that present again, my body stiff, my mind blank. My first thought, nothing more than the slow realization that I was still here. Could you live in a world where time itself stopped, where tomorrow was never a promise, but only a repetition? The ration that morning was laughably small, crust of bread that crumbled between my fingers and a smear of something that might once have been meat. I chewed mechanically, not for nourishment, but for ritual, a tease. The act of eating mattered more than the food itself. Around me, the others did the same, jaws moving in silence, eyes downcast. No one spoke, because speaking would have forced us to acknowledge the insufficiency of what we held. Hunger was no longer something we fought, but something we wore, like an extra layer beneath our uniforms. Could you accept such hunger, not as an exception, but as the permanent state of your existence? Orders followed, as always, spoken in the same flat tone. Reinforce, patrol. Wait. Waiting was the true labor, heavier than marching, more exhausting than digging. Waiting gnawed at the mind, at the nerves, stretched every moment until it felt unbearable. I sat against a trench wall, rifle across my knees, eyes fixed on nothing. The mud oozed between the boards beneath me, the air smelled of dampness and rot, and my thoughts drifted in dangerous directions. In waiting, the mind reached for home, for memory, for comfort it could not have. Would you survive such waiting without losing yourself? Or would you allow your own mind to become your enemy? By midday, the guns began again. Shells whistled overhead, crashing into the earth with deafening force. The trench shook, dirt showering down, boards splintering. I pressed myself low, covering my head, heart pounding against the ground. Explosion was a reminder that safety was only an illusion, that death could come at any moment without warning. My ears rang, my chest ached from the pressure, my eyes stung from dust. And yet, when the barrage ended, I was still alive, though part of me wondered whether surviving was victory or just prolongation. Could you rise from such bombardment, brush dirt from your shoulders, and prepare for the next one as though nothing had happened? The afternoon was spent in uneasy silence. Cued, weapons counted ammunition, whispered brief words of reassurance that sounded hollow even as we spoke them. One man stared at his hands for so long that I began to wonder if he even knew they were his. Another rubbed a small coin between his fingers, the surface worn smooth from endless repetition. We all had our talismans, rituals, objects, fragments of memory that kept us tethered. Mine was a folded scrap of paper with words that had faded almost beyond recognition. A letter from home. I read it when I dared, though the words hurt more than they healed. Would you cling to such fragile things, even knowing they broke you a little more each time you held them? Toward evening, we were ordered on a patrol. We climbed from the trench, boots sinking into wet soil, rifles heavy in our hands. Sky was low and gray, clouds pressing down, the air thick with the smell of smoke. We moved cautiously, eyes scanning the horizon, ears straining for sound. Every step felt like trespass, as though the land itself wanted us gone. We passed broken fences, shattered trees, a well half collapsed and filled with murky water. Once, people had lived here, had drawn water from that well, had walked these fields in peace. Now it was only ruin. Could you walk through such a place without feeling the weight of all the vanished lives pressing against you? The enemy revealed themselves suddenly, as they often did. Shots cracked from the distance, bullets slicing the air. We dropped low, pressing into the ground, faces in the mud, hearts racing. I fired blindly, the recoil jarring my shoulder, the sound deafening. Shouts rang out, some ours, some theirs, all blending into chaos. The fight was short, brutal, disorienting. When it ended, silence fell again, heavier than before. We gathered ourselves, counted numbers, and found one missing. He lay a few yards back, eyes fixed on the gray sky, lips parted as though to speak. We did not linger. We could not. We returned to the trench with one less among us. Would you keep walking, stepping over the body of someone you had shared laughter with only yesterday? Night fell quickly after that. The sky darkened into black, stars hidden behind clouds, air damp with mist. We sat in the trench, lamps unlit, rifles across our laps. Silence pressed close, broken only by the occasional cough, the drip of water, the shifting of boots in mud. Fear in the night was not sharp, but endless, spreading through the darkness like fog. Every sound became a possible threat, every shadow a shape waiting to strike. My nerves twitched, my ears strained, my breath felt too loud. Could you endure such nights without screaming, without breaking under the weight of unseen fear? Sleep came late, shallow, cruel. I dreamed of home again, but in the dream my family did not recognize me. I stood at the doorway, calling their names, but they turned away, their faces blurred. I woke with my heart pounding, sweat cold on my neck, rifle clutched to my chest. Around me, others stirred with their own nightmares, but no one spoke. We never spoke of dreams, because dreams were too close to weakness, too close to truth. Could you carry such dreams silently, never sharing, never unburdening, letting them eat at you night after night? And so the day ended, not with closure, not with triumph, but with silence and shadows and the promise of repetition. That was the truth of war, not glory, not victory, but endless sameness, each day carving deeper into the spirit. If you still believe you could last, picture yourself here, in mud, in hunger, in silence, in fear, in dreams that betray you. Could you last? There are mornings when the cold feels sharper than the bullets, when rising from the trench floor is a battle in itself. That morning was one of them. My body ached with a heaviness that seemed to belong not just to me, but to generations, as though the weight of all who had fallen pressed on my shoulders. I pushed myself upright, slowly, feeling joints crack, skin tighten against damp fabric. The air bit at my face, a wind that carried the scent of smoke and wet earth. And, for a moment, I wondered if this was what eternity felt like. Not flames or torment, but endless gray and cold. Could you open your eyes into such eternity without breaking before the first step of the day? The ration was smaller still, a piece of bread so thin it dissolved on the tongue before it could be chewed. I chewed anyway, forcing the act to last, stretching the illusion of nourishment. Around me, the others did the same, their movements sluggish, their faces hollow. Hunger had carved deep lines into every cheek, sharpened every jaw. We looked like shadows of men rather than men themselves. Some spoke faintly of food back home, of feasts long past, but their voices broke quickly into silence. The memory of abundance hurt more than hunger itself. Would you speak of food if every word tasted like loss? Orders came, as they always did, flat and uncompromising. Patrol, reinforce, hold. We obeyed because obedience was easier than thought. I cleaned my rifle, the cloth frayed at the edges, my hands trembling with cold. The weapon gleamed faintly in the pale light, but to me it looked less like a tool and more like a chain. I had carried it so long that my arm felt naked without it. Could you live with such a burden, knowing your survival depended on something you hated to touch? The patrol left mid-morning, boots sinking into mud that clung with greedy hands. Landscape stretched wide and empty, scarred by craters, littered with broken wood and rusting metal. Once, people had farmed these fields, had walked them in peace. Now they were wastelands, stripped of life. We moved carefully, rifles raised, eyes scanning horizons that revealed nothing but ruin. Each step felt like trespass, as though the land itself rejected us. Have you ever walked through silence so deep that you felt like an intruder in the world itself? That was how it felt. Every step, another apology. The gunfire came suddenly, as it often did. Sharp cracks echoed across the field, bullets slicing the air. We dropped low, pressing into the mud, hearts pounding. I fired blindly, the recoil jarring my shoulder, the sound deafening in my ears. It rained for minutes that felt like hours. When it ended, silence returned, heavy and cruel. One of ours lay twisted in the mud, his body motionless, his face pale. We pulled him back, but his eyes did not close, and his chest did not rise. Could you keep moving after that, stepping over the body of someone you had spoken to only moments before? We returned to the trench with one fewer among us. The others looked at us with questions in their eyes, but no one asked. There were no explanations anymore, only absences. Absence became the language of the war, a language written in silence in empty spaces. I sat against the wall, rifle across my knees, listening to the silence. It was not quiet, but heavy, filled with everything unsaid. Would you endure such silence, or would you break simply for the need of sound? Afternoon stretched long, each minute heavy as stone. We worked at the trench, shoring up walls that sagged, scooping water from the floor, reinforcing edges with planks that cracked under weight. The labor was endless, circular, futile. The earth resisted us at every turn, collapsing what we built, reclaiming what we carved. It was like arguing with a god that refused to listen. My arms ached, my back throbbed, my hands blistered, yet still I dug, because digging meant surviving another day. Could you argue with the earth itself, knowing you would lose, and still fight on with each stroke of the shovel? As evening neared, the guns began again, distant at first, then closer. Shells whistled overhead, the ground shook, dirt rained down. We crouched low, covering our heads, hearts racing. Each explosion was a reminder of how fragile we were, how easily the earth could swallow us. The air filled with dust, choking lungs, stinging eyes. My ears rang so violently that silence afterward felt impossible. And yet, when it ended, we rose again, brushing dirt from our shoulders, preparing for the next. Would you rise again after such chaos, knowing it would only repeat? The sky darkened quickly after that, clouds swallowing the last of the light. We lit no lamps for fear of drawing fire. The trench was swallowed in blackness, faces fading into outlines. We sat, huddled close, coats pulled tight, rifles across our laps. The night was long, the silence heavy, broken only by occasional coughs or the shuffle of boots. Sphere in darkness was not sharp, but endless, spreading through the void. Like water, every sound became threat, every shadow suspicion. Could you sit in such darkness without losing your mind, without screaming just to remind yourself you were still alive? Sleep came fitfully, in fragments, broken by dreams. I dreamed of home again, but in the dream, the house was filled with mud, the walls crumbling, the roof collapsing. I reached for the door, but it dissolved in my hands. I woke, gasping, rifle clutched to my chest, sweat cold across my skin. Around me, others stirred with their own nightmares, but no one spoke. We carried our dreams like wounds, silent and unhealed. Could you survive nights where even rest betrayed you, where dreams were only another battlefield? That was another day. Hunger, silence, labor, fire, absence, darkness, dreams. Not heroic, not remarkable, not remembered in books, but heavy enough to carve itself into the bones of those who lived it. If you still think you could last, picture yourself here, crouched in mud, clutching a rifle, waiting for a dawn that will only bring the same. Could you last? I woke to the sound of dripping water, though, in truth, I never really slept. Sleep had become more like drifting across a thin surface, a fragile layer above a pit that could swallow you at any moment. My eyes opened because the body demanded it, not because I had rested. The trench smelled of rot and dampness, the same smells that greeted me every morning, the same smells that clung to every thread of my uniform. It was strange to realize how little the senses could distinguish one day from another. Each sunrise seemed identical to the last, until the idea of days blurred into something meaningless. Have you ever felt yourself dissolve into repetition, so complete that you no longer knew whether you were living or only repeating? That was the question that haunted me before I even stood. I reached for my rifle before I stretched, before I rubbed my eyes, before I even drew a steady breath. It was instinct now, automatic, a motion so ingrained that I no longer thought of it. My rifle had become the first and last thing I touched each day, as constant as my own heartbeat. Sometimes I wondered if it had fused with me, if my arm would feel incomplete without it. It is a dangerous thing when a weapon feels like part of your body, when survival requires you to hold so tightly to something built only to kill. Would you accept that bond, letting your identity merge with steel and wood? Or would you resist until resistance itself broke you? The ration that morning was barely more than a gesture, a crust of bread, a sip of water that tasted of iron. I chewed slowly, though it dissolved quickly, and felt my stomach protest the emptiness. Hunger was constant, yes, but what I realized was worse than hunger itself was how I had stopped remembering what fullness felt like. The body forgets pleasures it can no longer reach. Bread had once been soft, warm, fragrant. Now it was a damp crust in my palm, and my mind could not summon the memory of better bread without pain. Would you live on such meager offerings, knowing they starved not only your body, but your memory as well? Orders came, as always: patrol, watch, dig, wait. The monotony of those words felt heavier than the labor they described. Followed because there was no other choice. We marched across mud that sucked at boots, rifles slung across weary shoulders. The air smelled of smoke from distant bombardments, faint but inescapable, a taste of ash that coated the throat. Each step felt like dragging chains, but we moved anyway. Movement was survival, though it brought us nowhere new. Could you walk? Endlessly in circles, each step carving deeper into futility, until the ground beneath you felt like a cage. We reached the edge of a ruined wood, trees splintered into jagged stumps, branches blackened, leaves long gone. The ground was littered with fragments of shells, rusting helmets, scraps of uniforms torn from bodies long since buried or forgotten. Silence there was suffocating, a silence filled with the memory of battles that had burned everything away. I touched the bark of a shattered trunk, rough beneath my fingers, and imagined what it had once looked like, tall, proud, alive. The war had stripped even trees of their dignity. Could you stand among such ruins without feeling your own dignity stripped as well? The shots came suddenly, shattering the silence. Bullets cracked through the air, slicing bark, spraying splinters. We dropped low, pressing faces into mud, rifles raised. My breath came ragged, heart racing faster than thought. Fired into the grayness, not knowing what I aimed at, only knowing that firing meant survival. The noise filled every part of me until I could not tell where sound ended and fear began. Minutes stretched like hours. When it ended, silence fell heavier than before. One of ours lay motionless against the base of a broken tree, his face pale, eyes open. We dragged him back, but his body was already cold. Would you carry such weight, not only the dead, but the knowledge that you might be next? Returning to the trench, we fell into silence again. Each absence hollowed us further, but the war allowed no pause for grief. I sat against the wall, staring at the mud, tracing shapes with my finger that vanished as soon as I made them. My hands looked foreign to me, thin, cracked, trembling. I wondered if they still belonged to me or to the war. The line between myself and the soldier I had become blurred until I no longer knew who I was. Have you ever lost the ability to recognize yourself, to see your reflection and find only a stranger? That was what the trench gave me every evening. Afternoon dragged on, heavy with waiting. The guns were distant that day, only faint echoes on the horizon, but the silence in between them was worse. Waiting became a torment, more unbearable than noise. Each second stretched, filled with the possibility of disaster, until I felt my nerves unravel. Some men muttered prayers, others clenched their jaws, others simply stared at nothing. I felt myself drifting, my thoughts circling back to home, but the memories were fragile, fading. I tried to recall the sound of my mother's voice, the smell of bread baking, the laughter of a friend, but each memory dissolved before I could hold it. Would you survive the slow erasure of everything that once defined you until even your memories betrayed you? By evening, the air grew colder, the trench walls slick with moisture. We shared what little food remained, each bite smaller than the hunger it was meant to silence. One man spoke faintly of a festival back home, of lights strung across streets, of music in the air. Memory was both a refuge and a weapon, comforting us while wounding us deeper. I chose not to speak, not to remember aloud, because the pain of listening was heavier than the pain of forgetting. Would you dare to speak of home, knowing your words might destroy more than they saved? Night came slowly, pressing darkness into every corner. We lit no lamps for fear of drawing fire. The trench became a black pit, filled with shadows that shifted and breathed. My ears strained against the silence. Every sound amplified the drip of water, the shuffle of boots, the faint cough of a soldier trying not to be heard. Fear at night was shapeless, endless, a tide that seeped into every thought. I sat awake, rifle across my knees, eyes wide, though they saw nothing. Could you endure such nights without breaking, without screaming into the dark, just to prove you were still alive. Sleep came late, shallow, cruel. I dreamed of home again, but in the dream I could not enter. I stood at the door, calling names. That dissolved into silence. Windows shattered, walls crumbled, and I was left standing in ruins that resembled nothing. I woke with my heart pounding, sweat cold across my skin, my hands clutching the rifle so tight my knuckles ached. Around me, others stirred, caught in their own nightmares. We did not speak of them because there were no words that could make them smaller. Okay? Could you carry such dreams in silence, night after night, until your very rest became your enemy? Was another day. Hunger, silence, patrol, loss, memory fading, identity unraveling, dreams betraying. Not heroic, not recorded in history, but heavy enough to hollow any man who lived it. If you still think you could last, picture yourself here. Not only fighting hunger and fear, but the erosion of who you are, of the very memory of your life before. Could you last? I no longer knew if I was waking from sleep or from something else. Entirely, some half-conscious drift that barely deserved the name of rest. My eyes opened because they had to, not because I had closed them with purpose. The trench was the same as it had been the night before, the week before, perhaps the month before. Mud pressed into the boards, water dripped from cracks above. The air carried the scent of rot that had seeped too deeply to ever leave. The sameness was suffocating, and I felt as though I were dissolving into it, becoming more mud than man. Have you ever feared not dying, but becoming indistinguishable from the world that buries you? That was the fear I carried before even standing up. I reached for my rifle before I even stretched my back. The weight was familiar, hateful, necessary. My hand closed around it without thought, as though it were not a choice, but a reflex, like breathing. I wondered, not for the first time, whether the rifle knew me better than I knew myself. I had held it longer than I had held the hand of a loved one, longer than I had held a letter from home. It was my companion, my curse, my constant. Would you allow your soul to be bound so tightly to an object of death until you no longer knew where it ended and you began? The ration was pitiful, a smear of something unrecognizable on bread too stale to chew without water. I ate anyway, swallowing with effort, ignoring the twist of my stomach. Hunger had reshaped me. I no longer thought of fullness. I thought only of surviving the next hour without collapsing. Hunger gnawed at the edges of thought, made memory fragile, made dreams hollow. I realized, as I chewed, that I could no longer remember the taste of a meal cooked with love. Food had become fuel, stripped of meaning. Could you endure a world where even bread no longer tasted of comfort, only of survival? Orders came. Patrol, reinforce, hold. The words had lost meaning, yet they carried weight enough to move us. We rose, boots squelching in mud, rifles across shoulders, and marched because to stay was more dangerous than to go. The horizon stretched wide and gray, broken by the silhouettes of trees stripped bare, by craters filled with water that reflected nothing but clouds. I stared at the land and felt it staring back, hollow and accusing. Could you march across such emptiness without feeling your own heart hollow in return? We reached a field scarred by previous battles. Fragments of uniforms clung to the earth, helmets dented and rusting, bones half buried in the mud. No one spoke as we passed them. We had learned not to look too closely because the faces of the dead had begun to resemble our own. I forced my gaze ahead, but still my eyes caught on a hand protruding from the soil, fingers curled as if still reaching for something. I wanted to stop, to uncover the body, to give it dignity, but the order came to move on, and my legs obeyed before my heart could protest. Could you step past such remains, ignoring the silent plea of those who never rose? The gunfire came later, sharp and sudden, breaking the heavy silence. Okay, Bullets cracked through the air, and we dropped, pressing ourselves into earth that welcomed us like a coffin. I fired into the grayness, my shoulder jarring with each shot, ears ringing until all sound blurred into one endless roar. Fear was not new, but it still burned hot each time, filling the chest, freezing the blood. When it ended, silence returned, cruel and heavy, and we rose to find one fewer among us. His face stared upward, lips parted, chest still. We closed his eyes quickly, not for him, but for ourselves, because we could not bear their emptiness. Would you carry on as though nothing had shifted, though the space beside you had gone forever quiet? We returned to the trench in silence, boots heavy with mud, shoulders slumped with absence. No one asked questions. No one spoke his name. Speaking, it would have given the loss too much shape, too much reality. Absence was easier when left unnamed. I sat against the wall, staring at my hands, the cracks in my skin, the dirt embedded in every line. They no longer looked like my hands, but like tools borrowed by the war. I wondered if I would recognize them if I ever returned home. If you've ever looked at yourself and seen nothing familiar, nothing belonging to the life you once had, that was what I saw each time I stared at my own body. Afternoon dragged in endless waiting. The guns were distant, their echoes faint, but the silence between them gnawed at nerves. We busied ourselves with meaningless tasks, cleaning rifles already clean, tightening straps already tight, muttering prayers half believed. One man stared at a photograph until the image blurred with tears. Another carved marks into the trench wall, notches that grew without pattern. I traced shapes into the mud with my finger, watching them vanish as quickly as they appeared. Such gestures were the only proof we still existed, fragile rebellions against erasure. Could you find comfort in such small acts, or would you lose yourself entirely to the void? By evening, the sky burned briefly with color, streaks of red and orange piercing the gray. For a moment, it looked like beauty, like something untouched by war, and my chest ached with the memory of sunsets unspoiled. But just as quickly, the light faded and darkness returned. We huddled close, coats pulled tight, rifles across our laps. The night was endless, the silence suffocating. Every rustle, every drip, every sigh felt like a threat. Fear at night was not sharp, but sprawling, pressing into every thought, filling every breath. Could you endure such darkness, hour after hour, until your very mind began to fray? Sleep came shallow and cruel. I dreamed of home again, but this time I was invisible there. My family moved through rooms without seeing me. My voice called out, but made no sound. I reached for them, but my hands passed through air. I awoke gasping, clutching my rifle as though it could tether me to reality. Around me, others stirred in their own nightmares, but none spoke. We carried dreams like wounds, hidden and festering. Would you survive nights where even your rest stripped you of your own identity? That was another day. Hunger, silence, fire, absence, identity dissolving, dreams betraying, not recorded, not remembered, but heavy enough to crush the men who lived it. If you still believe you could last, picture yourself here, hollowed, blurred, a shadow carrying a rifle through endless mud. Could you last? Morning returned, though. It felt less like a rival and more like the continuation of a single, endless night. My eyes opened because they could not remain closed, my body rising from the damp trench floor by instinct rather than decision. The boards beneath me sagged with water, the walls smelled of mold and old smoke, and the air clung to the skin like a weight. There was no freshness in dawn, no promise in the pale light that filtered through the fog. It was simply another reminder that survival had extended for one more day. Have you ever felt betrayed by dawn? as though the sun itself mocked you for enduring another cycle you did not ask to live. That was what the light did to us. It revealed that we were still here, and that was both victory and punishment.